gentlemen, welcome back to the GSU Briefing, the official podcast of the Geoeconomic Strategy Unit. Today, we're talking about a developing story in the Middle East after what we all saw happen in Yemen between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, tensions between the two countries at an all-time high. And to discuss this very important topic, I have a very special guest with us, a very dear friend of mine, and a man who knows the Middle East like the back of his hand. Mr. Aurele Tobelem, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Ishan. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me on. As you said, there's quite a lot of chaos that's happening right now, but this particular chaos might be a bit more calculated than people think. So, as you've mentioned, there's things going on in Yemen. This is a symptom of the current fallout that's happening within the Gulf Cooperation Council itself, or the GCC. And once seen as the actual twin pillars of regional stability, the UAE and Saudi Arabia are now openly at odds. There are many reasons for this, but the main one concerning Yemen is that the UAE backs the separatist Southern Transitional Council, that's the STC, that people might be reading about in the news. This group seeks autonomy for southern Yemen. It's made up of a cluster of militants who are fighting for that cause. Saudi Arabia, in the meantime, supports the country's recognized government in Sana'a. Both of these groups ultimately are against the Houthis, but they're now engaged in an increasingly bitter proxy struggle against each other. Right, so Riyadh actually sees the UAE's growing influence in Yemen as an existential threat, largely because Riyadh does not particularly have good borders. Saudi Arabia borders Yemen, and Yemen has been a volatile hotspot for a very long time. Saudi Arabia wants to have control over that zone, not only militarily, but also economically, largely because of its proximity to maritime trade routes. Now, on the 2nd of January, the STC actually issued a constitutional declaration of a state of South Arabia, I believe. And this outlined a plan, including a 2-year transitional period for a new anti-Houthi microstate with Aden designated as its capital. That same day, however, the Saudi-led coalition actually struck STC positions in Hadramaut. That killed reportedly 7 people. And since then, scores of STC fighters have been either killed, captured, or wounded in ongoing struggles against the Saudi-led coalition. So that's quite a dangerous precedent to be setting in Yemen right now. We don't know exactly how it's going to develop, who's going to come out on top, but the reverberations are being felt quite clearly across the Gulf. And I think we're seeing a strategic realignment in Saudi Arabia as they struggle to stay relevant in today's developing landscape. That's the overview of what's happening right now. UAE forces, I think it's important to say, have already withdrawn from Yemen. They withdrew in the last week of December, but the escalations themselves marked a further retreat by the separatist forces that are being backed by the UAE. So as a result, the strategically vital eastern governorates of Al-Mahra and Hadramaut are now falling back into the hands of the Yemeni government. Now, of course, Saudi Arabia has issued a I would say, rather contrived invitation for dialogue to the STC, and the STC has accepted. The problem with their letter of acceptance is that while it's nominally constructive, it frames the talks as Riyadh kind of belatedly adopting the STC's own approach. It anchors participation explicitly in the STC's proposed constitution, and it limits inclusivity to only allies of the Southern National Charter, which is essentially its guidelines and principles. Not only this, but also reaffirms past and obsolete agreements whose conditions were never really fulfilled or implemented. So deeper fault lines lie ahead. I'm very curious as to how this is going to impact not only the trade, but also the military complications that are already occurring and deeply fraught in that region.
I understand. So that is, you've dexterously laid out the present situation for us at the moment. Let's zoom out a little bit and talk about how did we get here? Because we're dealing with state actors, of course, and also a lot of non-state actors. That is complicating the situation, quite frankly, a little bit. So just give us a brief understanding of who's who, what are their different interests, and how these different interests are working on the ground to basically create this confused situation that we have in Yemen now, and of course, spilling over into the entire region slowly but steadily?
Of course. So, for those who don't know, the Houthi group, or Ansar Allah as they are known, is a jihadist militant group designated as a terrorist group by many countries that is fighting for their various objectives in control of Yemen, but particularly exporting jihadist ideology elsewhere across what we would call the Khalij or the Gulf. And this is very worrying, of course, to the UAE and Saudi Arabia currently share borders with Yemen. Oman has also been very concerned about this in the past, but it has not, as far as I know, sent forces into Yemen at any point during this conflict, at least not to confront the Houthis. The Houthis themselves are a very difficult group to deal with, largely because as a result of various factors, they are quite fragmented. But not least because of Israeli activity in Yemen that targeted much of their senior leadership in the past few months. But they are also a proxy of the current Islamic regime in Iran. And that also complicates matters further because these, at the end of the day, are mercenaries with an ideological attachment to what we would consider Shia internationalism. The Houthis adhere largely and foremostly to Zaydi Shiism and have found in the current government of Iran a chief sponsor. They've been distancing themselves for the past few months, given the hardships that Iran is currently going through, and we'll move on to that later. But it's important to know exactly what they're operating with, what their guidelines are, and what their objectives are, which ultimately is destabilization on behalf of a wider campaign to export what we saw in 1979, the Islamic Revolution, elsewhere. They want to start with the Gulf, and they want to then spread elsewhere. This is how they work. Against them is not only the Saudi-led coalition forces that are supporting or have pledged to support the current government in Yemen. I think it's important to clear that up. When we hear phrases like Yemeni government, it's important to do our own research and make sure that whatever source we're reading is referencing the actual Yemeni government, the one recognized as the legitimate government by the United Nations and other bodies, and not the Houthi government, which uses similar terminology in its self-description. That's important for anyone who might want to read up on them later. On the other hand, you have the UAE, which has become I would say, a pariah state almost in the Gulf, especially in the past few months, mainly not because of its growing rivalry, I would say, with Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has always fought to exercise effective control over the operations of the GCC. They're not particularly happy that they have a competitor in what they consider their own backyard. And they're determined to get out the UAE-backed STC at any cost. Even earlier today, which is the 7th of January, when this is being recorded, it was reported that they have continued in their bombing campaigns against the STC. They want them out. They want them out, and they want them out.
That makes sense. So talk to us about the stability that this is creating. I mean, the last thing that anyone wished for on their Christmas list was a little more instability in the world, and we have been getting a lot of that going into 2026 already. We have had earthquake after earthquake when it comes to geopolitics. So going forward in the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, which is a major trade route for economies worldwide, how do you see this spilling over and destabilizing and disrupting supply chains and trade routes?
You've picked up on a very important part of this, and I think we need to first, before answering that particular question, revisit the historic Somaliland recognition that was issued by Israel on the 26th of December of 2025. Few really understood at the time what this meant or how far the shockwaves would travel, but a week later, they're beginning to understand. So we have several countries, including Morocco, the UAE, and India, that are now poised to recognize Somaliland. And it seems that there's a new regional order that's beginning to take shape in the Red Sea arena. We're seeing overt spheres of influence, renewed block building, petroleum conflicts and very bold declarations that effectively are trying to draw lines in the sand and establish boundaries. It's reminiscent, I would say, of much warmer moments in the Cold War, and it's a bit worrying to see states returning to those sorts of tactics. But what Somaliland ultimately represents to the UAE and Israel is a strategic cooperative partner that is not only an alternative to Djibouti, which has allowed far more non-Western interference within its own trade infrastructure, but it's also a buffer against Islamist and Iranian influence in the region. So the Saudis themselves are fully aware that through alliances with Somaliland and a newly emerging South Yemen, the UAE and Israel stand a very real chance of controlling jointly the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So this is a strait which links the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden to the wider Indian Ocean. It's a vital artery for global trade, according to, I think, a 2024 review of international maritime transport by UN Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, as they're formally known. The strait carries about between 8 and 10% of global trade every year. In 2023, it was 8.7. This included about 20% of global container traffic, also 15% of oil products, and I believe 13% of crude oil. So control over this particular passage equates to effective dominance over one of the world's most strategically critical shipping corridors, right? So from a Saudi perspective, the prospect of effective UAE-Israel dominance over Bab el-Mandeb, even if it's short, even if it's short of formal control, raises existential questions about their own energy security, their trade, and just their socioeconomic success in general, as well as their leverage within the GCC. So the Saudis, in order to combat this, would have very little choice but to join the Abraham Accords framework, simply to keep their trade routes open in the Horn of Africa. And this is something that they do not want to do. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has firmly resisted this trajectory thus far, largely because he perceives that there's been no movement on the Palestinian question. He's not entirely wrong, but it's very worrying to see that there's this return to friction between GCC states on the subject of Israeli control of territories elsewhere. So the Saudis do not feel that the conditions are favorable for them, and they are willing to do anything in order to reestablish favorable conditions. And I think that's where we're seeing something that's very dangerous, because they are going to attempt to, at any cost, reassert their relevance in the GCC to combat growing Emirati-Israeli dominance. I think one thing I would ask you, Ishan, is what advice, based on the description or overview that I've just given, would you give to prospective investors on the oil industry in the aftermath of what we're seeing right now? Because I think it's going to be quite the development. I don't know if it will go up or down. I don't know if anyone does, but I'm curious what you would say about the current risk landscape.
The risk landscape is quite interesting, especially since you brought up oil. This is something that we've been following quite closely at the GSU. The issue is that when you see instances and instability in the Middle East, you would technically expect the price of oil to skyrocket. Case in point would be when we had the US strikes on Iran, and then Iran retaliated with strikes on American military bases in Qatar. The primary assumption would be, because the Strait of Hormuz being such a strategically important waterway for global oil trade, instability around that would basically lead to the oil prices going off the charts. That did not happen. We saw oil actually stabilizing with investors maintaining some level of confidence in the market. The situation that we see now is we see oil prices at around 60 Brent crude at the time of recording. And the 2026-2027 market already seems to be suffering from an oil supply glut. We have seen the OPEC plus countries artificially curb production, at least April 2026. And going forward, we expect supply to be quite strong in the market. And when you see, this is where we need to connect the dots to what's going on in Latin America and the US intervention in Venezuela now. Given that oil is such a big headline when it comes to that part of the region, and you're expecting more oil to come onto the market, you would expect the oversupply problem to exacerbate. However, we will definitely need to map the supply and demand dynamics with what's actually going on in the region on the ground in terms of geopolitical disruption. And one thing, in my opinion, that investors are starting to get tired of is talking about all this geopolitical noise and us giving them the indices of disruption going through the roof, but that not really translating into something on the ground. But of course, the situation in the Middle East, with that being so volatile, and you brought up the creation of Saudi Arabia, and now you've got Somaliland in the play. I don't know if anyone's been following this, Aurele, but the birth rate of countries has skyrocketed. This has never happened before. It's quite unprecedented. And that brings me on to my next question to you, is you've seen these middle powers in the region really trying to assert their dominance in terms of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and now Israel getting involved as well. What role do global superpowers such as the US play in this? Because historically, the United States has been the nation that has guaranteed security in the region and has really maintained that crucial stability in global oil markets. We have suddenly seen that evaporate. How do you see the US stepping in again? Will they step in again? Would they want to? Or are they just too busy now in their own backyard in Latin America, and they've just let the region be a free for all, where you've got Saudi Arabia, UAE, and all these middle powers trying to assert dominance and fill in the power vacuum?
Thank you, Ishan. I think there's often a misconception that what the US does in particular jurisdictions that seem to be more proximal to it by virtue of distance mean that it's only staying within its own backyard. We need to examine why Venezuela. Why Venezuela? There has been actually a very prominent, for nearly 27 years, I believe, nexus between Iran and Venezuela that has put a real dent in the ability of anti-regime forces in Iran to inflict any damage at all, as well as Western and anti-Iran superpowers, including the USA. The timing of this could not be more consequential. So Iran is in total freefall, right? This is, everyone agrees on this. They are facing total economic implosion. They're facing public fury and also a critical decline of resolve from local authorities and political elites. They're fighting a losing battle against their own people. And President Masoud Pezeshkian of Iran, his recent declaration of a full-fledged war against the West has left Iran very isolated, perhaps the most isolated it's been since 1979. Now, across the region and the world, I would say, governments are preparing for the real possibility of a post-Mullah's Iran. As it sits at the edge of collapse, serious questions are being asked about global oil security. Now, that Iran is in a real sticky situation, I would say, is best evidenced by the audacity of the US posture concerning Venezuela. Right? For those who are living under a rock, I don't know how you wouldn't have heard of this, but on the 3rd of January, actually, Donald Trump ordered the operation in Venezuela to remove Nicolas Maduro, the sitting autocrat and dictator, recognized as illegitimate by many countries, from power, and his wife as well, and to move them to the US, where they are currently being charged with any number of crimes, including narco-terrorism. But Maduro's fall is not merely a Venezuelan upheaval. It carries particular weight given the long-standing relationship between Tehran and Caracas. So for more than 2 decades, as I've said, Iran cultivated very deep political, economic, and strategic ties with Venezuela. First under Hugo Chavez, and later under Nicolas Maduro. And this was anchored mainly in shared hostility towards the United States, reinforced by billions of dollars of Iranian investment, largely so that Venezuela would look the other way when its IRGC-affiliated entities were being set up in favor of Iran, of course. So the free operation of Hezbollah in Venezuela for years has been of particular concern to US authorities. Now, with Maduro removed and Venezuela's alignment in flux, Iran has not only just lost a very crucial and key ally in its ongoing fight against the West, but it's also lost privileged access to the world's largest reserves of oil and precious minerals, including gold and silver. Once you strip away the actual rhetoric, the speculation, it's very clear. Venezuela's long-term importance to both Tehran and Washington has, of course, been ideological, but more importantly, it's been about resources. And I think Trump has just upped the ante, really, by sending a message to the current Iranian leadership through this invasion of Venezuela. That the US has announced that it will effectively be running Venezuela for the foreseeable future is of concern to many. It's certainly of concern to me. I don't know how they're going to achieve that or how they plan to. And as you've said, we're not necessarily sure what's going to happen to oil security given that. Do you think that in the event of regime collapse in Iran, there's likely to be a greater reliance on the US for oil security given what they've just achieved in Venezuela? And if so, what do you think that's going to look like?
It all depends on what the plan is, because like you mentioned, removing, deposing, and replacing a government is one thing. But people really are very quick to ask the next questions, which is what next? How are we going to manage? And how are we going to do damage control? Especially in today's interconnected economy, one thing very quickly is linking to the other. We started with talking about Yemen, GCC, Iran, and now we're already talking about the developing stories in Venezuela. I think what the US is really trying to identify over here is, let's look at it from the US going towards energy isolationism, specifically in terms of energy, because they're already producing enough oil. They don't need, technically speaking, foreign oil anymore. They don't really need to rely on the Middle East like they did previously for continuous inflow of energy, specifically oil. They're producing quite a bit of crude themselves. Natural gas is another one. And now you've got intervention in Venezuela and basically Trump giving US oil companies a carte blanche to exploit Venezuelan oil reserves, which, as you mentioned, are the largest in the world. Now, the question is what happens next, right? Because Maduro has been removed, no question about that. But what's happened is the internal situation is not really that different from what it was in the past. You've got the vice president still there, you've got the military leader still there, and you've got the minister of the interior still there, with all three of them having their own interests. Going forward, we have to figure out how the power vacuum develops, who takes control over Venezuela, to what extent are US oil companies themselves looking to invest in the region? Because you have to remember, Venezuelan oil is very difficult to extract and very expensive, therefore. Why would oil companies, given that we were just talking about oil prices being somewhere around 60 per barrel for Brent crude, would they really be as keen on investing in the region and extracting this very expensive oil when oil prices are not as high as they used to be? So oil security definitely depends on these various regions being stable, unstable. We do not know what's going to happen. It's all about diversifying sources of energy, in my opinion. That's why you've got more countries going towards renewable. You're seeing a push towards energy security like we haven't before. That's why critical minerals and rare earth elements are again in focus, because they're dual use. You also need them as much for energy security as much you need them for military use. So you're seeing a domino effect in the global political economy right now. So you've talked about the US over here. What's next for the Middle East going forward? What's the next big thing that we should all watch for?
Well, look, I think you picked up on something that's very important, which is the energy security aspect and why there are so many states that are now investing in different forms of energy and also in different technologies that are more sustainable. One enormous project that was very much prioritized by the Saudi strategists was actually the Vision 2030 project. It's run into many snags. I would say that by 2030, it will probably be categorized as a failure. The NEOM project is unable to maintain its own structure, largely because the pace at which Saudi Arabia needs it to move is not compatible with its current architecture, but they were relying actually on the Abraham Accords as a way of getting not only Israeli expertise and high tech, but also in other forms of intelligence sharing and gathering. And that was foiled in October 2023 by Hamas, where, of course, we know what happened, the massacres that sparked a very bloody, brutal 2-year war. And it seems that now, while the old order is seemingly falling apart, Saudi Arabia is not standing still. Like I said, they are fighting with all of their might to stay relevant in a region that is trying to move on from them, largely due to their intransigence. So in a move that is reminiscent of Cold War alliance politics, Riyadh itself is consolidating efforts with Pakistan, Turkey, to form a Muslim-led collective security network. Now, whether this takes the form of, I think it was called an Islamic NATO, that was a framework suggested by the Pakistani defense minister, Khawaja Mohammad Asif, that remains to be seen. The goal, however, is unmistakably clear, which is to counter both the uncertainty of Iranian adventurism and the growing Emirati Israeli dominance. There's a clear risk in this, though, and it's a risk that I don't think the Saudis have foreseen just yet. To build such an alliance, they may once again court very radical networks as ideological pawns, including jihadist movements. They would be repeating effectively the same mistake. There's a Lebanese researcher at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Hussein Abdul Hussein. He's observed that actually Saudi Arabia needs these foot soldiers as states across the region start preparing to inherit the collapsing Iranian empire, I believe is the words that he used. And in his assessment, Riyadh, which is often working with freelance partners such as the Palestinian Authority and also Egypt, is once again seeking to revive Islamist militias where expedient. Now, if they seek to reassert control over an evolving Middle Eastern landscape by re-weaponizing and investing in political Islam, much in the way that Qatar has done in the past decade or so, Saudi Arabia might find that the cure is much worse than the disease. And I think it's perhaps in direct response to this particular concern that developments across Israel's northern front are actually accelerating right now. The emerging Saudi-Turkish rapprochement is very alarming, especially for the United Arab Emirates. The UAE now faces allegations of cultivating ties with separatist leaders from the Druze minority community in southern Syria, who have openly floated the prospect of independence and autonomy within their respective regions. Now, Abu Dhabi, of course, has not publicly endorsed such aspirations, nor have they commented on them. But I believe that the prospect of Druze separatism or fragmentation, at the very least, especially in very volatile regions like Suwaida, was actually being used or may actually be used as leverage to keep Israeli-Syria security agreements intact, and also to distance Ahmed al-Shara from Erdogan. Erdogan has had a very Muslim Brotherhood-aligned neo-Ottoman posture essentially this whole time. It's only grown stronger since October 2023, and it continues to clash with the regional priorities of the Abraham Accords countries. So it's a free-for-all, I would say, at the moment, but a very calculated one. However, I'm very concerned at the trajectory that Saudi Arabia seems to be taking right now. They've offered to essentially run the Palestinian Authority on behalf of the Palestinians, as long as Israel releases funds that are dedicated for this purpose. I really don't trust it. I think it's one final attempt to be in control of what is happening in the Near East theater. And I don't think that Israel is going to go for it for many reasons, some of which are obvious, some of which are not.
I see. So you've given us quite a few things to watch for going forward. I think this is going to be critical as we enter the next few months of this quarter and 2026 at large. What's next in terms of geopolitics? I think that's one thing that I've always emphasized in this very volatile, very multipolar, and as we've been saying, free for all in some way, climate is basically trying to develop a sixth sense where it's not really important to master international relations theory or know the name of each president or what they're going to do, but essentially try to connect dots all across the globe in a way that we have really tried to do in this podcast, and essentially try to work out potential outcomes for each sector and then strategize accordingly, develop plans to diversify, to distance yourself and insulate yourself from the potential downsides that we might be expecting in this particular region and the sectors that we have addressed, from oil markets to renewable energy resources and rare earths, critical minerals. They're all very key going into 2026. I think these are important things that investors and global stakeholders will really need to watch for. And one thing, as we close, I think it's very important to thank you for your time and your insights that you've very expertly delivered to us. I think this has been a fantastic conversation, one of the best ones of the lot by far. And we wish to help our audience, help our readers understand more about the Middle East and also the external actors that are part of the region and looking to get more involved.
Of course. Thank you, Ishan. As always, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. You bring a lot of professionalism to these conversations and many very key insights that I hadn't considered before. So thank you for the conversation and thank you for the invitation. And I'm looking forward to joining again.